About 4 months ago, I saw a tweet. The tweet was from Josh Sawyer and it read, "I think games that devote most of their resources toward emulating the storytelling and mechanics of cinema are not interesting, even if very well executed." That tweet got me thinking about a game that I think about a lot called 30 Flights of Loving. 30 Flights is a small indie game from 2012 that costs $5, takes about 10 minutes to complete, and falls into the two dreaded categories of both walking simulator and artsy. But I love 30 Flights of Loving because to me, this is the most cinematic game I've ever played. When I see a tweet that talks about the storytelling and mechanics of cinema, or when I see people calling games like Red Dead Redemption and The Last of Us and God of War cinematic, I always want to say, no, 30 Flights of Loving is the only game that should be called cinematic. And that was originally what this video was going to be. It was going to be 30 Flights of Loving is the only game that should ever be called cinematic, and here's why. But in constructing that argument, I realized that the real lesson of 30 Flights of Loving is about more than just what should and shouldn't be called cinematic. 30 Flights of Loving is a game that exposes these ingrained assumptions about what we think games can or should be, and it shows us how those assumptions might be holding games back. But to get to that point, I gotta show you how I got there. So let's get into it. I'm Chris Davis, and this is 30 Flights of Loving. So again, everything started with this tweet about how games that devote most of their resources toward emulating the storytelling and mechanics of cinema are not interesting, even if very well executed. And of course, a lot of people read that tweet as either an endorsement or an indictment of their favorite game, because the tweet didn't really explain what the storytelling and mechanics of cinema were or how games were emulating them. In fact, even before this tweet, I started noticing that people had started calling games like The Last of Us and Red Dead Redemption and God of War cinematic, but I couldn't find a clear definition for why these games are cinematic or what makes a game cinematic. In fact, it appears this debate goes back at least 15 years, and after all this time, we still don't seem to have settled on a concrete definition for what makes a game cinematic. So I decided to make one. I set out to create a definition of what a cinematic game is. And of course, I figured that if I could create a definition for what a cinematic game was, it would prove that 30 Flights of Loving was cinematic, well, none of those other games were. So I started by considering the creative elements or tools that creators use to make video games and movies. As you might have guessed, a lot of these tools are the same, whether they're considered cinematic or not. Most games use tools that movies also use, like writing, music, visual effects, set design, costume design, acting, and maybe more. But these tools also overlap with other mediums as well, so they're probably not the thing that makes movies or video games cinematic. A better reflection of what makes something cinematic can be seen in the tools that don't fall into the middle of that Venn diagram. Video games use tools that movies can't use, like interactivity, choice, and challenge, while cinema uses a couple tools that video games don't use, like cinematography, which is the art of capturing or creating moving images, and editing, which is the art of combining moving images. This is where 30 Flights of Loving comes into play. 30 Flights of Loving definitely uses all these tools. 30 Flights has these sudden jump cut edits in the middle of gameplay. Editing, check. It often frames the game's perspective in a cinematography-like way. Cinematography, check. And the game is obviously an interactive experience that offers small dashes of choice and challenge. Check, check, check. And that was my original argument. 30 Flights uses all these tools, and although other so-called cinematic games definitely use the elements from the video game side of the chart, they definitely don't use the tools from the movie's side of the chart. Right? Well, let's check. These games do indeed use interactivity, choice, and challenge. I think that's pretty self-evident. But do they use cinematography and editing? Actually, they do, but only in certain sections of the game. Only in cutscenes. See, this is where things get interesting. If we consider these cinematic games as a whole unit, yes, they check everything off on both sides of the Venn diagram. But if we zoom in, we can see that these games aren't really using all of these tools at the same time. These games are divided into two different sections, and each section only uses the tools on one side of the chart. The cutscene sections of these games use cinematography and editing, but not interactivity, choice, and challenge. And the gameplay sections use interactivity, choice, and challenge, but not cinematography and editing. Now, I know that discovering that video games are divided into cutscene sections and gameplay sections isn't exactly a groundbreaking revelation. But stumbling across this fact made me ask, why? Why are video games split like this? Why are these tools seemingly divided by this wall that separates cutscenes and gameplay? And I think the reason is just that there's an assumption that the elements on either side of the wall are meant for performing a certain task. These tools are separate because they can't do what the tools on the other side of the wall are doing. Tools on the cutscene side are meant for telling the story, which is something that interactivity, choice, and challenge can't do, while the tools on the video game side are meant for providing active, visceral gameplay, which cinematography and editing can't do. And this is where we get back to 30 Flights of Loving. We've already talked about how this game uses all of the tools at once, but now the question is, does it use those tools to tell a story and provide visceral, active gameplay? Well, this is where we really get into those assumptions about what video games are or should be. Because if we're going by the popular definitions of story and gameplay, then no, it doesn't really do either of those things. But what it does show is how limiting those definitions of gameplay and story are. When we think about what it means for a video game to have gameplay, we really think of the word game, and the emphasis from the definition of game is on structure and skill and luck. When we think of the gameplay of a video game, we think about the loop of activities governed by rules that repeat over and over. When we think about what it means for a video game to tell a story, we really think mostly in terms of plot or lore. We think about story and storytelling as synonymous with conveying information on who the characters are, what environment they're in, and what exactly is happening. And when these are our definitions for story and gameplay, it makes sense that there's a wall between them. Trying to use cinematography and editing in a structured, rule-based system probably isn't going to work very well because it takes control away from the player. And likewise, using interactivity, choice, and challenge while trying to convey plot information means that some information could be accidentally missed or too difficult to access. But I think there's more to both of these objectives than just the narrow definitions we've created for video games. What if, when it came to gameplay, we put the emphasis not on game, but on play? What if we focused not on the rules and structures and skill of gameplay, but on the freedom of exploring and interacting and experimenting? What if, when it came to story, we put the emphasis not on plot, but on other storytelling elements like emotion and imagery? What if telling a story in a game became about more than conveying hard plot information and was instead about conveying an experience? What would a game that does all of that look like, that expands or rethinks those definitions? Well, it would look a lot like 30 Flights of Loving. Most people who play 30 Flights of Loving will get to the end and say, "That was weird, I don't know what happened." And that was my reaction after I played the game for the first time. But that reaction stems from the fact that we're accustomed to shifting back and forth between gameplay sections that provide structured skill-based gameplay and cutscene sections that convey plot. We're so used to shifting between the gears of gameplay and story that we don't know which gear to be in when we play 30 Flights of Loving. We know we're not in a cutscene section, so we're not in the gear of paying attention to learn who the characters are and what's happening, but we also know we're not in a gameplay section, so we're kind of wondering when we're going to get to use one of these guns, or solve a puzzle, or do something like we normally would in a gameplay section. So the whole game just sort of happens, and then when it's over, the response is, well, I didn't get either of the experiences I'm used to receiving, so I guess nothing happened. But of course, that's absurd. So much happened in this game, even in its very short runtime. When you carried your friend through the airport and got drunk at a wedding and got hit by that truck, that's the plot that you were looking for in the cutscenes. When you ate the orange and found the secret door and made your way to the party, that was the gameplay you were looking for. It's hard to parse these moments into gameplay and story, and none of them look like the traditional versions of those things that we're used to. But that's the real strength of 30 Flights of Loving. 30 Flights doesn't just tear down the top part of the wall that separates the creative tools, it also tears down the bottom part of the wall that separates the objectives of those tools. That's the real breakthrough with 30 Flights of Loving. I can think of fringe cases that merge the tools of cinema and gameplay by trying to bring them all over to the story side of the wall or the gameplay side of the wall, But because 30 Flights expands the definitions of story and gameplay, it also finds a way to combine them to create a new objective. Instead of trying to tell a story and provide visceral active gameplay, 30 Flights tries to tell a visceral, active, gameplay driven story. Now, to be clear, I don't think that the lesson here is that these big cinematic games don't tell good stories, or that we shouldn't have games with gameplay sections where you repeatedly kill zombies or whatever. I'm just saying that if video games want to tell stories, and not every video game should tell a story, that's okay too, but for the video games that do want to tell stories, they should do what 30 Flights of Loving does and consider how they might be able to break down the wall between gameplay and story and merge those two objectives into one thing. I'm trying to say that the potential of games as a storytelling medium is limited when we assume that games have to have gameplay sections that create rule-based, skill-centric gameplay and story sections that have to convey plot points. I'm trying to say that if we reject those definitions, if we fully break down the wall between gameplay and story, we can create a new type of story-based game that uses a new type of storytelling. A type of experiential storytelling, a type of storytelling that's told through the mechanics of games. I'm trying to say that we should stop worrying about whether games should or should not emulate the storytelling and mechanics of cinema. Instead, we should focus on exploring the potential of the storytelling and mechanics of video games. In fact, I think these big cinematic games are starting to do that, and that's why we're starting to see more little moments in games that sit somewhere between cutscenes and gameplay. Those are great moments, and I love seeing them in games. But if we're really going to fully break down the wall between cutscenes and gameplay, that has to start from the ground up, and that's just not how games are built. In fact, 30 Flights of Loving even teaches us that. The game's sole creator, Brendan Chung, put a developer's commentary mode into the game with these floating icons that let us read a little blurb about each scene. In the scene in front of the status board, Chung talks about this guy's headphones, saying, "See those headphones? They appear just once in the entire game. They're not critical for gameplay, they're for a throwaway gag." That is absolutely the wrong way to make a game. It's inefficient and against the most basic tenets of production. And well, doing things wrong is part of what made development of 30 Flights of Loving so fun. There's something wonderful about making things you know the player will only see for a few seconds. I think Chung is too modest when he calls those headphones a gag. Those headphones make that whole moment work. You're taking this guy's cart, and logic would dictate that he would get mad at you for doing that, but he doesn't. He doesn't even notice, which would also seem odd, until you see that he's wearing headphones. He can't hear what's happening around him, so he doesn't notice you. Without those headphones, the story of this scene falls apart. Those headphones aren't a gag, they're a critical part of the story of that scene. But as Chung says, including those headphones is, quote, absolutely the wrong way to make a game. Adding a detail that keeps the story of a scene together is, quote, against the most basic tenets of production. And that may be true, but 30 Flights of Loving asks, what if it wasn't?